From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Westin. Welcome. It's only been 4 days now since Congress enacted a bill including $2 trillion in new stimulus for the American economy to try to get us past this crisis. And already they're talking about something more. In fact, President Trump just today said he favors another $2 trillion for infrastructure. To get a sense of what is being discussed in terms of yet a fourth package now, we turn to Anna Edgerton. She's Bloomberg's congressional correspondent. So, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. What are we talking about?
Well, this was a really interesting tweet from the president because he sounded exactly like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They both said that they want infrastructure projects much more so than Republicans in Congress. And the fact that the president mentions low interest rates right now as a reason to pursue this kind of project is exactly what Nancy Pelosi said last week. So it looks like they're on the same page, but we haven't heard the same from Republicans. So we'll be asking Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell where exactly congressional Republicans stand on this as well.
And they may be on the same page, maybe President Trump and Nancy Pelosi when it comes to infrastructure, but there are other issues that are left over from that last bill that seems to be quite contentious. I mean, if they really do go forward with a fourth package, is it going to be as easy to get done as the last one?
That's a really good question, and it's going to kind of depend on the urgency. One reason why they were able to get this $2 trillion package through last week was because it was such an urgent problem. You could see the effects that the virus response was having on the economy in a very immediate way. So we'll see at the end of April when lawmakers get back to Washington whether or not there's the same sense of urgency. And a lot of that will depend on where the economy is. You know, last week we saw 3.28 million Americans filing jobless claims. We'll see what the numbers are this week and whether or not that encourages lawmakers to do more quickly.
Yeah, we have those jobs numbers coming out on Friday. Thank you so much to Anna Edgerton, our Bloomberg congressional correspondent. And now let's get a check on the markets from Taylor Riggs. The last day of the month, last day of the entire quarter, Taylor. Yeah. It's been a rough quarter. How are we ending up?
Yeah, it has been a rough quarter, David. So let's take a look at sort of how things are shaping up cross-asset. I want to start with the S&P. We're now up for 4 out of the last 6 days or so within the S&P 500, 5 in the last 6. So we're doing pretty well. We aren't seeing the types of gains that we've been seeing above 2 or 3% or so, but I think this sense of calm certainly is reassuring. You are still getting some buying of Treasury bonds. If the Fed's buying Treasuries, markets are buying Treasuries. So you're getting catching a bid here for full faith and credit, down about 5 basis points or so in yield. You are seeing high yield come off just a little bit. This is after it had been stronger for the last 5 days or so. But there are still signs that credit markets are thawing here. You had the first junk bond in about a month come to market. So you are seeing some signs of that market stabilization despite that high yield ETF being off about 0.2%. And you're seeing a little bit of weakening here in the yen. I do want to flip up board and see what this means cross asset for the quarter, because like you said, it has been a rough quarter still, despite some of the gains that we've seen in the last week on the major averages. S&P 500 still off almost 20% now year to date. Crude clearly bearing the brunt of that. Energy is the worst performer within the S&P 500, and so crude there off 66%. The 10-year yield, David, this is incredible. In 3 months, we've come down 124 basis points. So we're down now clearly well below 1%. You're still up almost about 18 basis points or so from the record lows that we had seen. And dollar strength is the name of the quarter. You'd seen massive funding issues given the strengthening of the dollar. Everyone wanted dollars in cash. And so for the quarter, Bloomberg dollar index, despite some weakening of late, still up more than 5%, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Taylor Riggs for that report on the markets. And now let's get a really review of the quarter. Cameron Christ from Markets Live, Bloomberg Markets Live, has a piece out today. Cameron, welcome. It's a little bit encouraging, actually. If you're in risk parity, it doesn't look as bad as maybe you thought it did.
Well, I mean, it not as bad as it looked a couple of weeks ago. It isn't the same as looking good, obviously. And, you know, there's the other issue of how many people have had the temerity to sort of hold their position throughout what's obviously been a tumultuous quarter, and particularly a tumultuous March. But if we certainly, I tend to look at these things on a monthly basis rather than a quarterly basis. But if we look at the performance of sort of a classic balanced portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% Treasury bonds, yeah, it's been pretty lousy this quarter. It's down like 5.2, 5.3%. but that's nowhere near as bad as it was a week or two ago. And really, it's not particularly notable if we go back in history. During the Great Depression, obviously, and even during the financial crisis, this sort of portfolio fared considerably worse than it has done this month as we come to a close.
Yeah, that's if your fixed income is in treasuries. What if you're in a broader set of bonds, both investment grade and otherwise?
Yeah, well, clearly you've done less well this month, but by the same token, you would have done less, or even more poorly during the GFC or during the Depression as well. As of yesterday, and this number is a rough approximation, the Bloomberg Barclays Aggregate Index, which is a mixture of all investment grade bonds, both government and corporate, I think was down about 1% on the month versus a rise of 3% for treasuries only.
So finally, looking forward into the next month, I remember talking to you last week, and you said some of what we're seeing in equities is actually rebalancing of portfolios. How much of that's going on even today? Is Wednesday likely to look very different from Tuesday?
Yeah, it's hard to say how much is going on right now. I mean, if we see a final flurry, it'll probably be near the close. But I do think that starting tomorrow, we'll get a cleaner read on things because we can be relatively sure that there's going to be less of this sort of flow than there has been over the last week or so. Plus, we get more forward-looking economic data. The ISM survey is, I believe, slated for release tomorrow. So that will give us kind of our first sort of A-list data that sort of accounts for some of the lockdown and economic shutdowns.
Cameron, finally, the government, the U.S. government, both in fiscal and in monetary, has really stepped up big time. How much of a difference has that made to investors at this point?
Yeah, I think that that's the important caveat to all this stuff is that this recovery that we've had from the lows of I guess a week ago last Friday is partially a function of the incredible response we've had both on the monetary side and the fiscal side. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, has the response been sufficient to sort of eliminate future risk? And I think the answer there is almost certainly no. Even as extraordinary as it's been, we don't have enough information to judge one way or the other. But insofar as we haven't yet seen the flow of credit to small businesses, clearly they are under pressure, and that's going to radiate throughout the economy. So I think it's a case of sort of they've saved the patient who's been hit by a bus in the emergency room, but there's still a long road to recuperation.
Yeah, and of course, the virus always gets a vote these days. Thank you so much to Cameron Kreis of the Bloomberg MLive team. Great to have you with us, Cameron. And now it's time for Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. CNN anchor Chris Cuomo has been diagnosed with COVID-19. In a memo to employees today, the network said Cuomo is feeling well and will continue to work from home. Cuomo was most recently at CNN's offices in the Hudson Yards neighborhood of New York City last Friday. He is the brother of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. The mortgage markets and the travel industry may get aid in a fourth round of economic stimulus. Bloomberg has learned the White House has compiled lists from government agencies totaling roughly $600 billion. Meantime, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says states and local governments will need more help. Spain has had its deadliest day yet in the coronavirus outbreak. The Spanish reported 849 fatalities in the last 24 hours. That brings the death toll there to almost 8,200. Spain has more than 94,000 confirmed cases. China says it has put more than 1,500 people infected with the coronavirus, but who don't have symptoms under observation. The move comes a day after China's premier urged local officials to prioritize efforts to track and expand the screening of symptom-free carriers. There has been growing criticism of China's failure to disclose accurate numbers. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up next, we turn to Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis about what this coronavirus crisis is doing to these presidential campaigns. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Well, even in the middle of a coronavirus crisis, there is a presidential race going on. We thought we'd check in and see exactly what it is to run a campaign in the middle of a crisis. For that, we bring in Bloomberg political contributor, now Stone Court Capital, Rick Davis. So, Rick, thanks so much for joining us over the telephone here. As I say, you actually have run a presidential campaign. That was John McCain's in 2008 in the middle of the great financial crisis. What do you do when you're running a campaign and something this big happens?
Yeah, thank you, David, and I'm glad to see that everybody there is doing well. Look, I mean, you lose control of the narrative. You lose control of some of your ability to function as a campaign. I mean, there are really three components of a campaign: money, organization, and message. And you prior to this kind of crisis, would have said you were in control of most of those things and knew what the outcomes were going to be. And then when you get thrown into a crisis like this, as we were in 2008 during the GFC, that you realize you don't control the outcome. So, for instance, Biden today having a lot of trouble raising money because in this environment, both logistically and motivationally, it's hard to raise money. He's better off on organization than he was a month ago because the nomination is frozen with him in the lead and likely to become the presumptive nominee over time, and so doesn't have to spend that much time focused on the primary activity. But on message, you know, he has a daily presidential briefing that he has to contend with, and he hasn't found his footing right now on how to communicate to the American public in a routine manner where he can extend his message in contrast to what the president's doing every day. So I would say it's an enormous challenge and one that will continue to change through the course of the spring and summer.
You say he's the presumptive nominee, which seems to be the consensus across the entire country. At the same time, how does he get nominated? Because we have primary after primary being postponed. I'm not sure when they're going to happen or how they're going to happen. And then we have, for example, Larry Sabato today writing about the possibility of virtual conventions. We may not even have the Democratic convention, particularly because it's earlier than the Republican.
Yeah, the Democratic convention scheduled for late July actually could pose a problem for the Democratic National Committee. Getting a nomination at this stage isn't really going to be a very difficult task. Rules are pretty loose at a state level, governed by the Democratic National Committee on what they've got to do to select delegates to the convention. Obviously, they are not going to be able to commit to the timetable that they had. But even the methodology could change. You could have state central committees and things like that making decisions in lieu of a convention or a primary or a caucus. So they'll come to grips with sort of how organizationally within the bylaws of the party that they can actually get these delegates elected. And Biden's polling advantage is still substantially ahead, almost more than 2-1 over Bernie Sanders. So there really doesn't seem to be any movement since the coronavirus outbreak really stopped the political activity. So Biden should be okay as time progresses. And I would say that the conventions are nice to have, but not a must to have. It's pretty clear this is going to be a very short campaign season where you would have the Democratic opponent running against the Republican Donald Trump. And regardless of the outcome of the conventions, the fall campaigns, September and October, are really going to be definitional. They usually are anyway, but it just means not much outside of coronavirus is going to be discussed before that. And I would think that that's very plausible.
The one thing you do have to have, though, is an election, a general election in November. You had Nancy Pelosi coming out and saying basically she thinks we should be looking at a vote-in campaign, that we should vote by mail, that we have to appropriate money for the Postal Service. Traditionally, Republicans have not been very enthusiastic about opening up the gates to voters.
Yeah, Republicans have never liked legislation that allowed either online registration, motor voter kind of legislation, or vote by mail. Many states now do it. Washington State is a 100% vote by mail state. Others have substantial amounts of their general election ballots cast by mail. But it's a patchwork quilt of rules and regulations. And in this last CARES Act that was just passed with $1 trillion worth of benefits, only $400 million was put in there to evaluate vote-by-mail options. Maybe 10 times that would have to be appropriated in order to actually facilitate a national vote-by-mail program. And that's if you could still get Republicans in the Senate and House to cooperate, with that effort. Obviously, everyone is hopeful that you don't have to go there, but you better have a plan, because the one thing we've learned is nobody knows how long or what dimensions this coronavirus will keep us occupied.
At the same time, at this point, and things can change, does it appear that this election will be determined basically on how President Donald Trump is perceived to have led us through this crisis?
That's right. I think that anybody talking about any other issue other than COVID-19 between now and certainly the fall campaign, but probably all the way through the election, is going to be wasting their time. I mean, this always has been shaping up to be a referendum on Donald Trump's presidency, and now his presidency is going to be defined by COVID.
Yeah, thank you so much to Rick Davis, our very special Bloomberg political contributor. I'm glad to see you're doing well as well, Rick. Coming up next, we're going to have Senator Bill Cassidy of the state of Louisiana. He's both a senator and a doctor. We're going to talk to him about what's going on in his home state. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Senator Bill Cassidy of the state of Louisiana is a Republican who is also a doctor in addition to being a lawmaker, and he joins us now. So, Senator Cassidy, thank you so much for being with us. As I say, you're a doctor, your wife's a doctor as well. Louisiana, I'm sorry to say, is becoming a hotspot. Give us a sense of the state of the virus in your state.
Yeah, it's spreading. It started in New Orleans, the New Orleans area. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, we had one case. Now we have over 4,000 with about 200 people dead. And so, and obviously it's mainly affecting the older folks, but it can also affect the younger folks. But Dave, when I talk to people, they want to know how we get out of this. How do we return to work? So one thing I published in the Wall Street Journal last Friday, an editorial, based upon my kind of experience as a doctor doing immunization work. Once somebody has been exposed and cleared the virus, and about 85% of the people who are exposed don't have symptoms or have minimal symptoms, they are now immune. Some people think the immunity, or at least that's the best thinking, and some people think the immunity will last for up to 3 years, which means they can return to work without fearing an infection or fearing infecting others. The nurse can take care of the routine patient without wearing personal protective equipment. The bartender can serve drinks, not fearing infection, not fearing being infected. And so this is a way forward. Congress has given CDC money to implement this program, but this is how we emerge from the medical crisis, which is causing the economic crisis.
I've heard some about that suggestion specifically, but do we need an effective antibody test in order to make sure whether somebody has the immunity or not? And do we have that test today, sir?
Two things. If somebody has been shown to be infected, okay, I had the virus, and now I'm a month out, you're 99% you're immune. In fact, 14 days later, 99% you're immune. So we do know that having once been established you were infected, then clearing virus means that most likely you're immune. A few exceptions, but that's for the doctors to talk about, not for a general program. The second thing is about the antibody test. Yes, that whole 85% of folks who didn't get tested because they either had no symptoms or they were minimal, there would be an antibody test to establish indeed you've been exposed. Now, a couple of the companies are now releasing these tests. We ask when they're going to be generally available, and there's still some limitation of supply, but you can make these generally available. Now, the fact that this can be done has been shown in concept. The Germans just tested everybody, and they established who is positive for immunity, who is infected, who is yet to be infected. But now, again, they're given immunity certificates, which allow people to return to work. So if you go to work, you don't have to maintain 6 feet between your coworker. You can kind of, shoulder to shoulder go at it, and that's going to improve efficiencies.
Are you concerned at all, Senator Cassidy, about the possibility of sending a message to the American people that you don't need to stay at home because of the hope of coming back? How do we make sure that we only let the people back that really do have the immunity?
So the Germans are doing it with an immunity certificate, but I'm basing it, when I was a practicing physician, I did lots of public health. And I based our approach upon that which we use for immunizations. When our children are immunized as babies, they are given measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis B, etc. That is put into an online registry, paid for by taxpayers, maintained by states. So they move to another state, they join the military, or they go to nursing school, medical school, you name it, and they've got to show proof of immunization. They can log on online, pull down that record of their immunization, show it, it's proof, boom, you're safe. So you can, and it's all compliant with HIPAA, with personal privacy protections for medical records. And so we can set up an immunity registry where the records are kept of the fact that I've tested positive for immunity in a way that can be foreordained. That will be established in the immunity registry. Now, when you go for employment, just like you go for enrollment in college, you're asked for proof of immunity or proof of immunization, in this case, proof of immunity, and you can see that. There's a clear message, constantly reinforced. If you're not immune, you need to stay at home. But if you're immune, you can now be the nurse taking care of the sick people without fearing to be infected. So there would be a reinforcement, if you will, of the need to be immune by this process. Right.
It's a fascinating possibility, and maybe it could get the economy going faster than we otherwise might expect. So thank you very much to Senator Bill Cassidy of the state of Louisiana for joining us today. And coming up here on Balance of Power, the airlines have been particularly hard hit by this virus, this pandemic around the world. We're going to get to hear from the head of IATA. That's the association that represents the airlines. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Welcome back to Bloomberg Balance of Power. I'm David Westin. We're coming now to our television and radio audiences worldwide. The travel industry, and particularly aviation, has been really hard hit by the coronavirus. And we have our anchor of Bloomberg Close. He's Guy Johnson in London with the head of the Aviation Association, that is IATA. Guy?
Thanks very much indeed, David. Yeah, we're joined by IATA now, the International Air Transport Association's Director General, Alexandre de Juniac. He used to run Air France, KLM here in Europe. IATA putting out updated numbers today, saying that airlines may lose $39 billion globally in the second quarter. Mr. de Juniac, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak with us today. Look, I'm wondering how long we've got before we start to see major failures amongst some of the biggest airlines that we know around the world. How long have we got before we start to see that happening unless government steps in?
That's a difficult question because, as you know, we have published figures about, the loss of revenues, $252 billion loss of revenues. The cash burn for the industry, which will account for $61 billion for only the second quarter, and the fact that we estimate that the airlines will run out of cash in 2 months, 2 or 3 months. So it means that in 2 to 3 months, if nothing is done, we could see bankruptcies for half of our airlines. The point is that the governments have reacted very strongly. They have put together very significant financial stimulus packages. And so if the money is on the table, and we urge government to put the money on the table and to inject it in the balance sheet of the airlines, we could overcome, this very, very difficult period. Otherwise, it will be difficult for many of us.
You're saying that the money needs to be put on the table. Are you suggesting that governments are putting out fine words at the moment, but the actions aren't backing them up? Do we need to see that money coming through a little bit more quickly?
No. We first of all, we are very grateful of government. They have done a very good job in putting together these significant, very significant packages. But now that the announcements are made, that the efforts have been done, we say we need urgently money. When we publish a figure about the $60 billion of cash burn in the second quarter, it means that we desperately need cash and urgently. And so we say to government, please now implement the promising, fantastic, policies you have announced.
Just in terms of how this is going to work its way through the system, we clearly have an urgent need for cash right now for the aviation sector in the United States, here in Europe and globally. But there is a danger and a worst-case scenario that what we see happening is that we see the current actions being taken by government to contain the virus working. We then see a return to normal life, but we then see a return of the virus later on, potentially in this year. Now, at that point, the airlines will have had their aid. They'd have gone back to kind of normal working conditions, and then we get hit again. What is the kind of the long-term plan here? If we do see a return of this virus, if we do see problems sort of reasserting themselves later on this year, how much patience do you think governments are going to have? Is this aid a one-shot for the carriers to put themselves back into a stable position? And if they don't, is there a danger that we see it returning later this year?
I think that it's not a matter of patience. It's a matter of being able to overcome a crisis in one wave. We hope it will last only for a few months, and that's all. And if there is a second wave, nobody can be held responsible for that. And we hope that government, will come back with additional packages or cash injection, because nobody, we cannot say that anyone is responsible for that. We have to fight against this coronavirus. We have to overcome the different waves, if there are several. One, hopefully, and if there is a second, again, we will ask for help. And we think that governments will understand that it's not the fault of anybody. We have to.
Right. So this is not a one-time request you're making for government. This could be potentially further aid being required further down the road. This isn't just the here and now. There could be further aid required.
Of course, we understand that the real point there is to see whether or not the resources of government are unlimited. We know that they are not unlimited, but we hope that they will have enough financial means, enough money to help the whole economy, because we are not alone to be in a difficult situation, and the airline industry in particular. So that's what we expect. And if you have seen our figures, you will see that we expect. Yeah, please. Sorry.
Sorry, time is short.
Okay.
Do you expect that corporate demand and leisure demand will return in the same way to the same sorts of levels? People talk about a V-shaped recovery. What do you think is going to happen in the airline sector? How quickly do you think demand is going to come back? And do you think this will be seen by corporations as an opportunity maybe to trim budgets? We're all sitting here at home at the moment. We're all learning to work remotely. What kind of long-term threat does that pose in terms of demand, corporate demand, for the big global carriers?
Of course, we see a risk of a slow recovery that would be triggered by two elements. First of all, the fear of potential passengers to fly. There is a second point also is, in addition to that, there is obviously everywhere in the world a slowdown, even a recession. So the cumulative action of recession plus a reluctance of passengers to take the flight again could slow down the recovery. And our hypothesis is that the recovery is not a V-shape as it was in previous pandemics, so quick and strong, but could be slower, more a U-shaped curve that would be the recovery profile.
Mr. Juniac, one final quick question. Emirates is going to get a slug of cash from Dubai. We're going to see different schemes being put in place in different parts of the world. Do you think we end up with a level playing field for airlines when we come out of this?
We will probably end up with a different playing field with probably slightly more consolidation because we will see some bankruptcy, probably. Secondly, if the states are injecting cash through capital increase or through buying shares, we will see more public participation or public stakeholdings in the airlines. So it will probably change the attitude towards the state-owned or the partially state-owned companies because many companies will have public shareholding in their capital.
Yep.
So it could change.
Yeah, it was interesting to see what happened with some of the banks after the great financial crisis. RBS, big state holding, that was a tough thing to manage. Mr. Juniac, we really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Balance of Power. David, Alexandre de Juniac, the Director General of IATA. Back to you.
Thank you so very much, Guy, for that really interesting and important interview. And now it's time for Bloomberg First Word News. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton. Mark?
David, a grim milestone for the United States. The U.S. death toll from the coronavirus is now more than 3,500, eclipsing China's official count. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said today that deaths in New York State had risen more than 300 from the day before, now topping 1,500. The governor's brother, CNN anchor Chris Cuomo, has been infected with the coronavirus. CNN says he's feeling well and will continue to work from home. New York City is getting help from the federal government in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is sending 250 ambulances to New York City, staffed by 500 paramedics and medical technicians to help its fire department respond to an unprecedented number of medical calls. New York City has also reported its first virus death of a person under the age of 18. The European Union is telling its member countries not to forget about human rights as they fight the coronavirus pandemic. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's comments came a day after Hungary's parliament approved a bill giving the government extraordinary powers with no end date in response to the pandemic. France has also passed a law increasing the prime minister's powers, a move harshly criticized by human rights groups. The Trump administration is reviewing some waivers on U.S. sanctions against Iran. Russian and European and Chinese companies will be allowed to continue to work on Iran's civilian nuclear sites without penalty. The U.S. says restrictions on Iran's atomic work remain in place. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had opposed extending the waivers, but Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin argued it was a way to help Iran deal with the coronavirus outbreak. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Orlando, Florida is a city that really depends on tourism. We're going to talk with its mayor, Buddy Dyer, about how it's faring during this time of the coronavirus. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Theme parks have closed. Tourism is brought to a stop, which means that Orlando, Florida really is hurting right now. And we are joined by its mayor. He's Buddy Dyer. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for joining us today. Before we get to the economics of this for Orlando and for Orange County, give us a sense about the people there. What is the state of the coronavirus in your city right now?
We have 300 cases as of yesterday in Orange County, so we are the fourth most impacted county in the state of Florida right now. The South Florida counties of Miami-Dade, Broward, and West Palm having a lot more cases than we do, but we're starting to certainly feel the impact. And right now we don't have enough testing ability to really know what's out there, so 300 could be 600 or 900 for all we really know here. But we issued a stay-at-home order last week, and people are abiding by that. We allowed essential businesses to stay open. But we recognized early on that we needed to do some things. So before St. Patrick's Day, we closed the bars and limited the restaurants, and then subsequently closed the restaurants to takeout only. So we took some preliminary actions, not having big parties on St. Patrick's Day, that I think really helped us out.
And you and your counterpart in Orange County, working together, as far as I could tell, really moved quickly on that and fairly aggressively. The governor of the state is taking a somewhat different approach, sort of doing it piecemeal, or sort of county by county, as it were. I guess the south of the state also has very big problems. Is that approach helping you or hurting you, that the governor is not statewide saying, let's just shut it down?
Well, if I had my druthers, I'd obviously rather see the entire state follow a stay-at-home approach, because if people are getting infected in some of the other neighboring counties, and we don't even have consistency through the I-4 counties. Hillsborough and Pinellas have issued stay-at-home orders. Osceola has. I know your audience probably doesn't know all these counties by name, but Tampa, St. Petersburg, and then Orlando and Kissimmee have issued stay-at-home orders, but none of the other surrounding counties have done so.
So as we know, the large companies such as Disney have closed down the theme parks, but they're very large companies. They have very deep balance sheets. There are a lot of small businesses that are ancillary to that tourism business. How are they faring right now? And can they hope to get money out of the federal government, this $2 trillion grant from last Friday, in time?
So our small businesses are really hurting, just like I think most areas around the state, but we do have a lot that were tied to the tourism economy. There's a lot of people that have been laid off here. As I understand the federal package, there is aid for those people that were making less than $75,000 a year, and the business loan packages relate to keeping employees on. But we have a lot of restaurants that have laid a lot of people off, so there are a lot of people that are looking for ways to make ends meet right now.
At the same time, Mr. Mayor, it must put a lot of burden on your social services at the same time. People need a lot of help right now. How are the finances of Orlando doing?
The city of Orlando itself, we're largely property tax driven. So our city government budget has not been affected in the way some other either state governments or local governments that are more reliant on sales tax. So, and we have a substantially large reserve. We've always been very financially strong, and being a state that's prone to hurricanes, we've always recognized the importance of having money set away to use in emergencies, and this would certainly qualify. I guess that's another thing to think about here in Orlando. I've been mayor now for 17 years, so I've been through 5 or 6 hurricanes. I've been through the Pulse shooting, and this is an entirely different type of situation where it's not localized just to Orlando. It's got its grips on the entire country, actually the entire world. So we're in a boat with a whole lot of other communities, and we're struggling for resources that everybody's competing for.
Yeah, it also strikes me it's different from a hurricane, that a hurricane, as devastating as it is, as tragic it can be, you know that there's a day, 2, 3, 4 days down the road where the sun's going to shine again. We don't know about the sun shining here. How are your hospitals doing?
Our hospitals are not overrun yet because we have not reached whatever the top of the curve is going to be for us. That's projected 4 or 5 weeks from now. So we're trying to take every measure that we possibly can to flatten the curve and make sure that whatever that peak is, our hospitals and healthcare professionals are able to accommodate that. And our citizens, we're used to working together. And in some respects, they're looking for the leadership, being told what's the best way that they can help out. And we've let them know staying at home and only going out for essential trips is the most important thing that they can do to shorten that time frame that we can't see on the horizon.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, thank you so very much for joining us. It's Buddy Dyer. He is the long-term mayor of Orlando, Florida. Coming up here, we have at least a candidate for a possible vaccine against the virus. And HHS is going to play a critical role. We talk with former HHS Secretary Kathleen Sebelius about that. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. We learned yesterday that Johnson & Johnson, working together with an arm of the Health and Human Services Department, that is BARDA, has come up with what they think is a promising candidate for a vaccine against the coronavirus. They're going to try to test it as early as September, maybe get something out in case of success as early next year. We are joined now by Kathleen Sebelius, who was Secretary of HHS under President Barack Obama, and of course before that, Governor of the state of Kansas. So, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. I must say I had not followed BARDA very much. Could you explain to us exactly what their role is in this and what the process is for identifying and then testing out a vaccine?
Sure. Well, David, good to be with you. And BARDA is a little known but very, very important entity within HHS. It is, the name stands for the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and it's within the Office of Emergency Preparedness and Response that has a broad coordination for, as it says, responding to emergencies, natural and man-made and pathogens and biological attacks. So BARDA is an entity that is directed to coordinate 3 very important HHS agencies: the National Institutes of Health, and people have gotten very familiar with Tony Fauci, who leads the institute designed for vaccine development; the Food and Drug Administration, that has the regulatory agency within HHS that has the responsibility of actually making sure that medicines are safe, effective, they do the clinical trials, and they eventually give the okay to distributing any kind of medication to the public; and the Centers for Disease Control, that is really the public health backbone of the United States Health Department. They're the epidemiologists. They track, surveil, and mitigate situations. So BARDA has a coordination responsibility, and they really are charged with getting as quickly as possible safe and effective medical countermeasures prepared, sometimes just to put in the stockpile. They do a lot of analysis of what may be coming down the road, of what we're seeing, of what we may need. But in this case, they would be the agency charged with, if you will, taking down, all the barriers, making sure agencies are talking to each other and coordinating as fast as possible federal response.
Yeah, fast as possible. That's what I was going to ask about, because in talking to Alex Gorski, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson yesterday, he said they hope to have field trials started in September. And if that happens, and in success, we don't know it'll work, but they think it's promising, then they'd have a vaccine perhaps in the second quarter of next year. Is there any way to compress that without running undue risk or concern?
Probably not. Unfortunately, we're in a situation, there is no coronavirus vaccine. So when I was secretary, we had the H1N1 outbreak, a flu strain that hadn't been seen since 1918. But the good news on the vaccine side was that there were flu vaccines. Every year, scientists projected what was the likely flu strain and tweaked the annual vaccine. So we could actually kind of tag onto that process and develop a much faster vaccination. This really starts from scratch. And so testing, first of all, safety, and then testing efficacy, does it really work, is a process that really takes some time.
You can't rush it very much. So thank you so much to former Secretary HHS Kathleen Sebelius. She's going to stay with us in the second hour of Balance of Power over on radio. This is Balance of Power for our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Westin.